Welcome, I'm Ashley of The Ugly Sheep, and today we're going to measure a warp on a warping wheel. To get started, you will need the warp you're going to use, spare yarn in a contrasting color that is at least twice the length that you need to measure, scraps of yarn to tie the warp chain together, scissors, and a measuring tape. Let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is make a loop at the end of our yarn. And once we have that, we're going to measure how long we need our warp to be. Once we figure out how long we need to have the warp measured, we're going to make a knot. I like to make a loop to make it easy to find as I'm making the path on the warping wheel. To make a smaller area for the cross, you're going to just use the 3 pegs on the top, and you're going to secure it to the first peg, and then go under the second peg and over the third peg. And then you're just going to wrap the yarn, that measuring yarn, around the warping wheel, leaving space between each rotation until you get to your knot. And then you can move the peg until you have it in the position that can meet your yarn at close to your knot. If you have to make a decision on to make it to a little bit smaller or a little bit longer, go for a little bit longer than you need, like I did here, to ensure that you have more than enough warp for your project. Once your peg is secure, you're going to then follow your path back up to those 3 pegs at the top. And then instead of doing the same path over those 3 pegs, you're going to go over the right peg, over the second peg, and underneath that first peg to make your knot, so that you have a cross section between peg 1 and peg 2. If you want a longer cross section to warp from back to front, hang tight. I will show you how to do that later on in the video. Next, we're going to put our yarn cone on the floor and make another loop at the end of the yarn for the yarn we're going to measure as our warp. And we're going to start at that single peg at the bottom and follow our path all the way up to get to the cross at the top. When you get to the top, you're going to want to go under the middle peg and then go up over the left peg, then down around, and go over the middle peg and over the end peg. Going up from the peg to the cross is the first warp thread, and going back down is the second warp thread. You always want to work in pairs on the warping wheel, and if you need to have 10 warps per inch, you're going to want to go up 1, down 2, up 3, etc. until you get to the very end of your warp. To make a counting string, we're going to take a length of yarn and tie the 2 ends together to make a big loop. And then we are going to put it underneath the warp threads, being careful not to get our measuring warp in there. And we're going to pull the string through the warp, tightening the bottom of the loop that you just pulled through to tighten the count around your yarn. This is just showing how it's done to secure the second inch. Once you have your warp measured, you're going to want to cut off the end of the yarn with enough space to tie another loop to end your warp. Now it's time to tie off the warp so it stays in the nice even braid that we made. You're going to put yarn through the very end, being careful not to include your measuring warp in with your regular warp, and tie that off at the end. You will need that as we get the chain started, as we take it off the warping wheel. Next, we're going to make a choke, and I like to double this just to make it a little stronger as you pull tightly to make sure the threads can't come undone around each other. And I just make a bow so that all of my ties can come off easily without scissors after I have it on the loom. I make sure there's a tie each time the warp goes around the wheel one full time to make sure that things don't shift out of place. Now it's time to secure the cross, which means that we're going to tie the upper threads on the right side, the lower threads on the right side, the upper threads on the left side, and the lower threads on the left side to make sure that that cross stays in place, so that we make sure that as we are threading our loom, we are always taking the next thread to keep things from tangling. Once everything is tied in place, you can start moving the warp away from the back threads to make sure that nothing has gotten tied in the process that should not have been. And at this point, I will take my bottom peg off of my warping wheel because, as you can see, it's usually pretty tight, which means it's kind of hard to get it to come off. So you can move it one peg at a time to make some room, or you could just take the bottom peg off. Either works. Now it's time to make our warp chain. We're going to take that end that was on the peg, pull our hand through to pull the yarn ahead of it through the loop you just made. And we're going to do that all the way up to make a braided looking line until we get to where our cross is. I always leave the cross out so that it is easy to find when I'm storing it, so that I make sure I pull from the correct end when I start to warp. For those that want a little bit more space between the edge and their cross, you'll notice that there are two pegs on your wheel, one at the top and one at the bottom. So if you want more space, use the peg at the top and then make your cross the same way, going under the middle peg one direction and over it in the second direction. But then you will be wrapping your end of your warp around that peg after your cross to give you plenty of room for working with it at the loom. Now that we have our warp, what's your next project? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're there, make sure to like and subscribe.